Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Millie. Welcome back, everyone. You're on track one. I am here. It's my privilege to introduce you to Team Henry Ford, which is Ellice, Jillian, Jim, and Brian. They're here to talk about pushing the limits, how the Henry Ford uses its collections management system as a bracket sort of dam for collections multimedia. Ellice, over to you.
All right. So first of all, we're going to talk just a little bit about who the Henry Ford is if you don't know who we are. So Brian, if you go to the first slide, thank you. We're currently known as the Henry Ford, but we were founded in 1929 in Dearborn, Michigan, just outside of Detroit, by Henry Ford as the Edison Institute on the 50th anniversary of Thomas Edison's invention of electric light. Henry was really interested in significant achievements of industrial history like Edison's, but also in everyday life. Next slide, please. We have two really large venues, a 600,000 square foot museum, and then Greenfield Village, which is an open air historical village with about 80 historic structures. We also have a giant screen theater. We run a factory tour for Ford Motor Company. We have a public charter high school on campus and also an on-site reading room. And our collections, we have more than 250,000 3D artifacts, as well as a really vast archives, a lot of material in storage, about 500,000 records in EMU, which is our collections management system, and about 107,000 online. Next slide, please. And then I wanted to go through just a really quick intro to our homegrown dams so you have some context for Jim and Jillian, who are going to explain a little bit more about what it is and how we use it. So we do have separate workflows for creating images of 3D and archival items, but then from there, they kind of follow the same process. So metadata for both go into EMU, our collections management system, and image files are stored on a network server. We export metadata from EMU daily, and scripts pull images from that network server, pre-process derivatives for the web, and then deposit those images on Amazon Web Services and add the metadata to our database on Sitefinity, which is our web CMS. From there, APIs make the metadata and images available to our digital collections elsewhere on our website, and also to some digital experiences on the museum floor, which I'll touch on a little bit later. We're not really going to talk about video in this presentation, but I wanted to include it here so people know. It goes through a slightly different but overlapping process. We use Bright Cove as a delivery platform, and Bright Cove has its own APIs. So in some instances, we pull metadata from EMU for these, but in other instances, we pull metadata from Bright Cove or both. So that is the super quick overview of what our system is. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Jillian to talk about how we actually populate the system.
Hello, everybody. All right, first things first, let's talk about how we get the Henry Ford's assets into our system without using a traditional dams. Next slide. Here's a little bit of background on our system. Our process begins with a request from a curator for the digitization of an artifact. It'll be a 3-dimensional request fulfilled by me and our photographer, Rudy, or a 2-dimensional request fulfilled by Jim or Brian and his staff. Once the object has been imaged, edited, and uniquely named, the imager will upload or import the files to our CMS, as mentioned, EMU by Axial. The imager is responsible for adding metadata. Some of those fields are highlighted on this screenshot from EMU. After the files are uploaded, the record is complete and ready to go online. The record receives a final review from our registrar staff, who mark it as ready or flagged in our lexicon. This is what brings our quote unquote dams into action. Once the flagging step is complete, the image files are uploaded from our server once the harvest, which is our export process, is complete. Next slide. Next, let's dive into the exciting world of file paths. Now, one of the most important metadata aspects of the process is the file path. The path is unique to each image file since each file has an individual ID number highlighted on this screen cap. It's imperative that everything's named and stored correctly. If there's an inconsistency, it won't derail the entire harvest, but an error, like an incorrect path, wrong accession number, missing file, etc., will cause the upload of that singular image file to fail and display a spinning wheel graphic online where the image should be. Also highlighted on the screen cap is the file path. It's derived from the artifact succession number and notes where it resides within our database. Once the record is flagged, our system knows where to pull the files off of our internal server to load onto our website. Next slide. Here's a peek at one of our network directories. We have the individually named folders for each object seen on the left, and on the right, the interior of a folder with each uniquely named image file. Then at the bottom, there it is again, a file path. It's the same as the relation field in EMU, so coming full circle, this is how our system points from EMU to our network. Next slide. The export is another key part of our DAM system. Without needing to do a manual upload of the images every day, it is automated to take place after hours. This is helpful when we're uploading hundreds of image files and metadata within a day. Of course, this also saves us time and doesn't take up valuable computing power by users during normal 9 to 5 working hours. On the right is the page on our website for the address that you saw the record for on the first slide. Note how the metadata is pulled directly from EMU and displays the associated object ID and the ID file numbers for that address online. Next slide. But with any process, there will always be a margin of error. This screen capture shows what the site looks like if there's an error in the record in EMU. We get the ever dreadful spinning wheel. We have our system set up so the day after the harvest, all parties receive an email to notify users of the harvest completion and if there were any errors during the export process. If there are issues, they'll show up on a report shown here, generated by our system to list which records failed. This report helps pinpoint errors so we don't have to manually check new records, and will catch new mistakes so we don't have to find out months later that an object wasn't appearing correctly online. This is probably a way our system differs from an actual DAM's because once an error is resolved, changes made will be reflected after the next harvest that night and show up online the following morning. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of insight into what our process looks like. But that's it for me. Next up is Jim, and he will be talking to you about how we use our system to fulfill researcher and customer requests.
Thank you, Jillian. Next slide, please. Most of the materials in our collection have not been individually cataloged or digitized. For this discussion, I will focus on the materials that have already been added to our digital collections website. Next slide. All of the images on the digital collections website may be downloaded and used for non-commercial purposes under a Creative Commons license. High-res versions of select images may be downloaded for a fee via the website's built-in self-service e-commerce function, which you can see down in the corner there. The e-commerce function has not been enabled for every image. Next slide. The Henry Ford makes images from our collection viewable online as part of our nonprofit educational mission. However, some materials may have restrictions which prevent us from licensing them for certain uses. Review is ongoing. For requests that cannot be fulfilled through the self-service e-commerce function, I can retrieve the files and guide the user through our permissions process. Next slide. All images on the digital collections website have metadata in EMU, which can be used to locate the full-size image files on our server. The files can be retrieved manually using Windows File Explorer. Next slide. For larger requests, the file metadata from EMU can be used to generate a command line script that will automatically retrieve multiple files from multiple folders on the server. With that, I will turn this over to Brian Wilson, who will talk about how we use our system internally.
Hello, everyone. As Jim mentioned, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about how well our system works or perhaps doesn't work for our internal users, and in particular from my point of view as our archivist. So this is a somewhat simplified view of the system that Ellice showed earlier. And here I'm concerning myself with the two pieces outlined in red. The CMS, which in our case is Axial Emu, and storage, which consists of a number of virtualized Microsoft Windows Server domains, each containing a large number of folders and files. Put numbers on that, we're currently managing 17.5 terabytes of data across 10 virtualized network drives. CMS and storage are interconnected, or perhaps more accurately interrelated, by file paths in the form of URLs entered in the records for the objects cataloged in the CMS, as you've seen earlier. It is that URL that ties the physical object with its digital representation, allowing for a level of management and definition of the digital assets and creating the sort of DAMs for internal users. What then are the issues with the system, particularly from the point of view of the archives? The primary issue is that the system was created in order to supply the digital asset data to a software application and not to the human users of the digital assets. Accessing the digital assets for human users using the location data string is not a single mouse click process. It requires permissions to and knowledge level of both the CMS and of the storage, and some degree of computer technical skill. These barriers work directly against the archive's goal of increasing access and use. Our sort of system is just not as easy to use as it should be if we were concerned and prioritizing our staff as the end users. So that's a big problem, but there are a few others. A second kind of related issue concerns restrictions on access and use. Because the key piece of data that ties an object to its digital representation is contained in the CMS, access to that data is necessarily limited by security and permissions requirements, but also from a user skill and technical knowledge perspective. This issue is highlighted by the email request I've shown here. Amber, a colleague on our video production team, required a high resolution version of an image already online, but she had to email one of my staff to obtain that high res version, adding to both of their workloads. The third issue is that the system contains, in the main, replications of objects which are required to have been both formally accessioned into our permanent collection and cataloged in the CMS. This means the system does not contain data created for regular business purposes, such as our promotional videos, brochures, programs, or even our employee newsletters. This works against our access and use goal, but also the preservation goal, in that these objects may be stored on local unbacked up hard drives or in locked network folders and lack version control. And in fact, some departments are operating their own asset management systems in addition to what we're describing here today, which just then complicates everything. The last issue I'll mention does concern preservation. Our storage contains both replications and original born digital collection objects. This mixing involving both storage locations and storage ingest processes raises security, privacy, traceability, and originality concerns and complicates development of preservation schemes. So those are the issues with the system, but hope is not lost and there are some upsides. And I'll mention two of those here. First, compared to our environment 10 years ago or so, we've greatly improved the quality of storage location information and the distribution of that information. We no longer have a single gatekeeper. And second, the location string data is extractable from the CMS and so can be manipulated in other applications such as Excel. So where would I like the system to go for internal users? I think we would all like to see a move to or towards a more human-centered system that would lower the barrier to entry, and with that lower barrier, create a larger group of users. This would aid in empowering and prioritizing our own staff and their work in addition to our public visitors. I think our president should be able to at least be able to view these digital assets without having to be a CMS power user. We need to expand our definition of digital asset beyond replications of cataloged collection objects and seek to capture more of the non-collection digital assets that are being created and used, and then distribute those assets to a wider group of our internal users. Our preservation environment for digital collection objects is in need of improvement. That involves creating storage, ingest, and access processes that are separated from those used for the object replications. And finally, we need to look at improving the storage and playback of our digital video assets, again, to make those more widely distributed and directly accessible by the end users. And now Ellice will describe how the system is used to deliver collections data.
Right. So yes, Brian just talked a little bit about pros and cons of our homegrown system for internal usage. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of using the system to deliver collections data externally. Next slide, please. So the GIF on the right should run through a demo of using our digital collections website, so you can kind of get a sense of how the images and metadata we deliver through this system work with our web functionality. And then the chart on the left shows growth in views of our digital collections over the last 5 years, which is the orange bars, compared to the cumulative number of artifacts we've digitized, which is the black line. So the last couple of years obviously have been a little strange, thank you pandemic, but up until then, views of our digitized artifacts were growing at a much faster rate than the rate at which we're digitizing. So it seems like the system that we have for delivering this data, as well as the website we have to display it, is really enabling us to get our collections out into the world to audiences we might not have been able to previously reach. Next slide, please. So we are also creating this interlocked system of online and on-site content that has our digital collections as the foundation. So we're making the most of the time, effort, and cost of digitizing. We have a few experiences on site that use this faux dam system, either live or not quite live. On the photo on the bottom left, you'll see we have kiosks that are on the museum floor and a couple other places with digital collections and additional context around those. The photo in the middle of the slide is our Adobe Timelines experience, which uses algorithms to match any pose you strike with a similar pose from an image in our collections. And then the photo and the GIF on the right show our collections connections table, which is one of my favorites, which combines digital collections, images, and data to allow you to explore unexpected connections between artifacts, either made by curators or made by machine learning. So the kiosks and the connections table both refresh daily from our sort of DAM system. And for Adobe Timelines, it's its own kind of thing. But we did use this system, me to find and select images to include, and then Jim, using the file paths, was able to relatively easily pull thousands and thousands of images to load for Adobe Timelines. So, you know, none of this stuff would really be possible without this robust system to support it. Next slide, please. And then our sort of DAMs is also supporting an integrated content delivery system online. So for years, like many museums, we've been developing online content to share our collection stories. Beyond our digital collections, we have a blog with nearly 1,400 posts, almost all of which cross-link to our digital collections, and then our digital collections cross-link to the blog. We have nearly 400 artifact sets. We have innovator interviews that are served from Bright Cove. We have a YouTube account that goes back 14 years. We have a Google Arts and Culture account, and many, many other content types on our website. So some of these pull directly from this sort of DAMs database, and then others we recreate in our web CMS or external CMSs. But again, all of them benefit from the fact that the system exists and we can easily gather metadata and images for whatever we're doing next. Next slide, please. So again, I think overall the system works pretty well to meet our current and kind of near-term future needs for collections content delivery. But what are some of the things that we're thinking about to either improve the system or meet potential longer-term goals? One is, you know, we're always trying to reduce the workload wherever possible for folks like Jillian and Jim who work in the system every day. the system is automated, yay. But with automation comes complexity. So we'd like to have a little bit better insight into when things fail. If something doesn't show up on the website, like where did the issue come in and why? We are also, again, longer term looking at like, if we want to move to an open data model, could this system support that? Will it support new media types, which as everybody knows are just evolving at a crazy rate? And then mass digitization is something we've talked to some partners about. If we were to undertake a mass digitization program, could this system support it? And that is really it from us. That's kind of a whirlwind overview, but we're happy to take questions if anybody has any.
That was fantastic. That was a true illustration of teamwork. From that forward. Thank you very much. And can I just give a shout out to the screenshot of a command line prompt, which was fantastic for those of us born in the 1900s. Yes, that's a thing, but may need some explanation to some folks attending. But I had a big question, and it was Heather Courtney also has a similar question. So you've got this, you know, you're creating this kind of digital asset management environment. You have an Axial product. Axial and Pixion announced a partnership in I think the beginning of last year. Is that a strategy for you to bring on a solution provided asset management system, or are you staying on the path with what you have?
I don't know. I guess I can take a stab, and then I have a feeling Brian has thoughts too. You know, again, I think this works sort of well for one small piece of what we do, like the delivering collections. Institutionally, as Brian pointed out, like, you know, we have a creative services department that has their own kind of internal dams that when I need an image for a marketing purpose, I have to go ask them because I don't have access to that system. So I do think it's a larger institutional question of like, how do we want to handle assets as an entire institution and not just strictly for the purpose of delivering collections.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say as someone who manages, as someone who also manages staff, I'd say we have to be very careful about the load we put on our staff. So if we bring in another system to manage, then we need folks to manage that system. So that's also an issue, I think.
You mentioned preservation before. Is that a true preservation system? Is it doing anything special? John Peel has that question.
No. So the storage that we showed is not. It is Microsoft Windows storage. Right. Nothing special. So any of the preservation pieces on top of that are actions that we're taking ourselves as archivists and other users in the system to record file movements, file changes, those kinds of things. And then, you know, backup routines that our IT department supplies and making sure that that's okay. I think we're on a continuum with preservation, and I consult regularly with my colleagues fortunately at the University of Michigan and other institutions around to make sure that what we're doing is directionally correct. And we may not be able to do what the university does, but we're at least moving in, not going down dead end streets with regards to preservation, I think.
Okay. Rupert has a question. Are you keeping track of the different external and online systems that refer to your objects? And if you are, how are you doing that? I guess tracking what's out there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say in some cases we're doing really well, in others we're not. It is a little tricksy. I was shortening my pros and cons and future hopes for length of the presentation, but one I had in there was that I didn't end up talking about is like system integration. So like as we're kind of digital collections are down here and the system is down here, but then we're building like online content and digital experiences and other things above that. Like we have different sets of data coming in at different points. There's reasons for that as well, but the downside is you don't, like, the system down here doesn't always know what's happening up here because it's not happening in that CMS.
Right.
So I would love to have us have access to a little bit of that, and whether it's like back engineering, like, again, like literally we can associate blog posts with digital collections artifacts in our web CMS. But again, I know that because I have access to the web CMS. Most people do not. Like Brian or Jim or Jillian wouldn't know that, like, oh, this blog post is associated with this artifact unless they went to that artifact page and saw the blog post there. So it is a really good question. I'm always kind of jealous when I go to a digital collections website for another institution that, like, where they're like, here's the 57 places this artifact has been published or used. I think it'd be great to move to that. We're just not quite there.
Okay. And this, you have your own engineering team on staff that is helping you with this this system. Is that right?
Sort of.
Kind of. Okay.
we do have a database manager. We have our web team is contractors. So we do have a couple of internal staff, but they're not technical. So for kind of, again, those higher levels, it's contract assistants. But for actual management of EMU, we do have a database administrator.
And what about training? There was a question about training. Is it a difficult system to learn? I mean, was there focus on the UI as you were building this?
Brian, do you want to take that one? I don't know.
Well, yeah, so we have, I mean, it's several parts. So I think the training itself is broken down along those lines of the parts. So we have, our own internal training set up for using EMU. So users of that system are running down one kind of training path. Network storage, that's a combination between perhaps the archives and our IT department to put together the procedures and processes that we're using to store our materials there. All the backup routines and all those kinds of things are all dealt with on IT, so they have their own training paths. And then the sort of content feeding to the external application, I guess I'd kick that to Ellice to respond as far as what kind of training we're doing there.
Yeah, it's we're a little short-staffed, and I tend to be the intermediary just because I know our database administrator knows a little bit about it and our web vendor knows a little bit about it, but we do tend to be sort of hazardously low staffed, and like who kind of knows a little bit about all of the parts of that process once stuff leaves EMU. So again, I think that's another area where we need to beef up our staff a little bit.
Well, if there's any attendees who are well staffed in this area, please make yourself known in the chat. Meredith has a question on the preservation topic around video assets. That preservation storage, does that include video as well?
Yes, it does, for selected materials. So we have several different types of, I guess, video or several sources. So we're creating video, continuously for our kind of internal applications, for commercial use and so forth. The majority of that material is stored elsewhere. The video that we have stored in the system that we showed today is either originally created interviews, so born digital video interviews done in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, or replications of film or historic video. And that material is stored within that Windows server system. What we don't have, because of the size of those files, we do have a problem then streaming those internally. So often the representation that you would see in the catalog system is just a screenshot of the video or a frame. rather than delivering that through the collection management system. We have to take care of that in another way.
Right. Okay, that was fantastic. Team Henry Ford, you lived up to the name. Really appreciate putting that presentation together. I know there's a recording. We now have a short break in terms of the conference sessions today. There's our Birds of a Feather sessions facilitated round tables. You can join those through the lounge tab. Take a seat at those virtual tables for some discussions on previous topics. And at that, I think we are at time. Thank you very much, Jim, Brian, Ellice, and Jillian. That was great. Appreciate your time. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.